today's video, we're examining a winter mountaineering expedition on Colorado's Capitol Peak that didn't go according to plan. Two experienced climbers set out for what should have been a routine ascent, but sometimes the mountains have other plans. What unfolded next will show you just how quickly things can change in extreme environments. It was January 8th, 2017, and the pre-dawn darkness at 2:30 a.m. over Colorado's Capitol Peak carried the brittle stillness that signals extreme cold at high altitude. The temperature at the 9,400-foot Capitol Lake trailhead had already dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit when Derek Ashford and Cameron Steele began their ascent toward the notorious Knife Edge Ridge, unaware that a series of equipment failures would leave them lost in conditions that would prove fatal to even their considerable wilderness experience. Derek Ashford, a 29-year-old Denver firefighter, had built his reputation on technical mountain rescues throughout Colorado's Front Range, combining advanced wilderness medicine training with over 12 years of backcountry experience that included avalanche certification and dozens of successful winter ascents. His professional experience treating hypothermia victims had given him intimate knowledge of how quickly conditions could deteriorate in extreme cold, while his volunteer work with Denver's mountain rescue community had honed the methodical risk management approach and equipment standards that had kept him alive through numerous emergencies in terrain identical to Capitol Peak's challenging environment. Cameron Steele, a 31-year-old wilderness EMT for Summit County Rescue Group, brought extensive high-altitude medical expertise to their partnership. Having successfully completed winter ascents of 15 Colorado 14ers, including technical routes on Longs Peak and Mount of the Holy Cross, his professional responsibilities responding to backcountry emergencies had taught him to recognize the subtle early symptoms of hypothermia and understand how quickly conditions could deteriorate above tree line, while his advanced wilderness medicine training in high-altitude environments made him one of Colorado's most accomplished winter mountaineers with a proven track record of sound judgment in extreme conditions. Their combined experience totaled over 25 years of technical mountaineering, with both men having responded to dozens of winter emergencies involving equipment failures, hypothermia cases, and navigation problems in terrain, similar to Capitol Peak's exposed ridges and technical approaches. The Capitol Peak expedition represented an ambitious winter objective planned as a celebration of Steele's 31st birthday with an attempt on one of Colorado's most technical 14ers via the standard route that included the infamous Knife Edge Ridge. They had selected this route based on current avalanche conditions reported by state avalanche forecasters and weather forecasts that indicated stable conditions with manageable wind speeds and temperatures for the first half of the day. Their route planning included detailed topographic analysis, escape route identification, and equipment selection based on worst-case scenario planning that accounted for a potential weather deterioration or equipment failure. Both men carried comprehensive winter mountaineering equipment, including 4-season mountaineering tents, sleeping bags rated to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, emergency food supplies sufficient for 4 days, and multiple layers of technical clothing designed for extreme cold conditions. Their navigation equipment included a primary GPS unit, backup GPS device, topographic maps in waterproof cases, and backup compass systems. Their families expected them to return by 9 p.m. for Steele's birthday dinner, providing a clear timeline that would trigger search efforts if they failed to return, a safety protocol both men had established for all their backcountry expeditions. Capitol Peak's standard route rises through dense forest before breaking into exposed alpine terrain above tree line, where the notorious Knife Edge Ridge presents Class 3, scrambling across a narrow rock spine with 1,000-foot drops on both sides. The mountain's 14,130-foot summit sits in an environment where wind speeds regularly exceed 50 miles per hour during winter storms, creating conditions that challenge even experienced mountaineers with proper equipment and extensive cold weather experience. The terrain features steep couloirs, exposed rock faces, and cliff bands that become invisible during whiteout conditions when blowing snow reduces visibility to less than 20 feet. At this elevation, temperatures routinely drop below -25 degrees Fahrenheit during winter, creating wind chill values that can freeze exposed skin within minutes and overwhelm the thermal protection capabilities of even the most advanced mountaineering clothing systems. The combination of altitude and extreme cold creates a physiological challenge that compounds rapidly as the body's oxygen processing efficiency decreases while heat loss accelerates through radiation, convection, and conduction to the surrounding environment. The physiological challenges of this environment compound rapidly as altitude reduces the body's ability to generate heat, while extreme cold accelerates heat loss through multiple mechanisms that can overwhelm the human body's thermal regulation systems. At elevations above 11,000 feet, the human body's oxygen processing efficiency decreases significantly, reducing physical performance and cognitive function precisely when survival depends on optimal decision-making and physical capability. The reduced oxygen availability affects the brain's ability to process information and make complex decisions, while simultaneously reducing the body's ability to generate heat through metabolic processes. Survival time in these conditions, even for experienced mountaineers with proper equipment, drops to 3 to 4 hours without adequate shelter, while the construction of effective emergency shelter requires physical and cognitive capabilities that deteriorate rapidly as hypothermia progresses. The mathematical relationship between heat loss and heat production becomes increasingly unfavorable as physical exhaustion reduces the body's ability to generate warmth, while environmental conditions continue extracting heat at rates that exceed human physiological limits. Weather forecasts issued by the National Weather Service had specifically warned of extreme cold and high winds for elevations above 10,000 feet, with predicted wind chills reaching -45 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the day, and sustained winds of 40 to 60 miles per hour, with gusts potentially exceeding 80 miles per hour. Mountain weather stations throughout the Elk Range had recorded temperature drops of 20 to 25 degrees below normal for the season, creating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced winter climbers with professional-grade equipment and extensive cold weather training. The forecast included explicit warnings about rapidly changing visibility conditions, as blowing snow would create whiteout conditions above tree line, with visibility potentially dropping to zero during peak wind periods. These conditions had prompted the closure of several nearby ski areas and the cancellation of multiple guided mountaineering expeditions scheduled for the same weekend, indicating that professional guides with extensive local knowledge considered the conditions too dangerous for client operations. Both Ashford and Steele had reviewed these forecasts during their pre-trip planning session the previous evening, analyzing the predicted conditions against their equipment capabilities and experience levels. They determined that their combined experience and equipment selection provided adequate safety margins for the planned route, based on their successful completion of similar ascents in comparable conditions over the previous several years. Their decision-making process included identification of multiple escape routes and bailout options that would allow them to descend to safer elevations if conditions deteriorated beyond their comfort levels. However, their planning had not anticipated the cascade of equipment failures that would begin around 11 a.m. as they approached tree line at approximately 11,500 feet elevation. During a steep section requiring technical movement over icy rocks, Ashford slipped and his pack struck granite, damaging both his primary GPS unit screen and cracking the waterproof case containing their backup electronics. The impact occurred during a moment when both men were focused on route finding through dense timber, and the damage wasn't immediately apparent until they attempted to check their position. The backup GPS unit initially appeared to function normally, but began providing inconsistent readings as they climbed higher, displaying position data that jumped erratically across a several-mile radius. The extreme cold was affecting the device's battery performance and internal electronics, causing processing delays and display anomalies that made it impossible to determine their actual location relative to their planned route. Both men initially attributed these problems to temporary interference from atmospheric conditions rather than permanent equipment failure. Their topographic maps, stored in the same case damaged during Ashford's fall, had become saturated with moisture that caused the paper to become illegible in critical areas, while the ink began to run and blur. Their backup compass had also been damaged in the impact, with the needle mechanism affected by the shock, making precise bearing readings unreliable in the whiteout conditions. The cascade of equipment failures represented every mountaineer's worst nightmare. The simultaneous breakdown of multiple redundant safety systems that had been carefully selected and tested before the expedition. Ashford's fall had occurred at the worst possible moment, when they were transitioning from familiar terrain into the technical sections where precise navigation becomes critical for survival. The impact had not only damaged their primary navigation tools, but had also compromised their emergency communication capabilities, creating a situation where they were effectively cut off from any possibility of outside assistance. Both men's bodies were diverting blood flow away from their extremities and non-essential organs to maintain core temperature, reducing the oxygen supply to their brains and impairing their ability to process complex information and make critical decisions. Both men's bodies were diverting blood flow away from their extremities and non-essential organs to maintain core temperature, reducing the oxygen supply to their brains and impairing their ability to process complex information and make critical decisions. By 1:30 p.m., both men recognized that they had descended into unfamiliar terrain in a drainage system that did not match any of the topographic features they had studied during their route planning. The whiteout conditions had eliminated visual landmarks that might have provided position confirmation, while their compromised navigation equipment left them unable to determine their location or identify a route back to familiar terrain. The drainage they found themselves in featured steep walls and technical terrain that suggested they had wandered significantly off their intended route. Ashford's attempts to operate the remaining functional equipment were hampered by the extreme cold affecting his manual dexterity, despite his use of high-quality insulated gloves designed for technical mountaineering. The temperature had dropped to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -50 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions that challenged even their professional-grade equipment and extensive cold weather experience. The extreme conditions were also affecting their physical performance and cognitive function, as their bodies began diverting energy from extremities to maintain core temperature. At 3:45 p.m., after nearly 3 hours of wandering in deteriorating conditions, Steele acknowledged their situation had become critical when he observed early hypothermia symptoms in both himself and Ashford, including confusion, slurred speech, and deteriorating coordination that affected their ability to navigate the increasingly difficult terrain. These symptoms, which both men recognized from their professional training and experience treating hypothermia victims, indicated that their core body temperatures had already dropped several degrees below normal, despite their high-quality clothing systems and continuous physical activity. The progression of hypothermia symptoms followed the predictable pattern both men had observed in emergency victims, beginning with peripheral vasoconstriction that reduced blood flow to extremities and progressed to central nervous system effects that impaired judgment and coordination. Steele's medical training allowed him to recognize that they were entering the moderate hypothermia range, where cognitive function becomes significantly impaired and the risk of fatal decision-making increases dramatically. Their emergency locator beacon had been damaged during Ashford's earlier fall, with the impact compromising the internal antenna connection. When they attempted to activate the device, it showed power but failed to establish satellite communication due to the damaged components. This equipment failure, combined with their navigation system problems, had created a cascade of system failures that eliminated multiple layers of their safety planning. The combination of navigation failure, deteriorating physical condition, and communication equipment failure had created a survival scenario with rapidly diminishing options for self-rescue. Both men understood that their situation had progressed beyond the parameters of their original risk assessment, entering territory where their survival depended on finding immediate shelter and halting the progression of hypothermia before their cognitive function deteriorated further. Their attempts to maintain systematic problem-solving were hampered by the insidious effects of moderate hypothermia, which impairs judgment precisely when clear thinking becomes most critical. The condition affects the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex decision-making and risk assessment, making it increasingly difficult to evaluate their options objectively. Both men had extensive experience treating hypothermia victims and recognized these symptoms in themselves, but knowledge of the condition provided no protection against its effects. At 4:20 p.m., while attempting to locate shelter in a wooded area that offered some protection from the wind, Ashford broke through a hidden snow bridge spanning a steep creek drainage and fell 30 feet into a rocky streambed below. The snow bridge, formed by wind-deposited snow spanning the narrow drainage, had appeared solid from the surface, but lacked the structural integrity to support his body weight, plus the additional load of his winter equipment and loaded backpack. The fall occurred without warning as Ashford stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground, only to have the snow surface collapse beneath him, sending him tumbling through space before impacting the rocky streambed below. The impact with granite boulders at the bottom of the drainage caused a compound fracture of his left leg, with bone fragments protruding through his insulated pants and creating an open wound that began bleeding heavily into the snow around his body. The head trauma from his impact with the boulders left him semi-conscious and unable to assist in his own rescue, while also creating the potential for intracranial bleeding that would prove fatal even if they could address his other injuries. Ashford's helmet had absorbed some of the impact energy, but the force of the fall had exceeded the protective capabilities of his safety equipment, resulting in a severe concussion that affected his ability to think clearly or coordinate his movements. Steele immediately climbed down into the drainage using their climbing rope, rappelling the 30-foot distance to reach Ashford's position at the bottom of the rocky streambed. However, he quickly realized that extracting Ashford would require technical rescue equipment and physical strength that exceeded his capabilities in his current hypothermic condition. The drainage walls rose nearly vertically for 35 feet on both sides, composed of loose rock and ice that provided no secure anchor points for a rope system capable of lifting Ashford's body weight, plus the additional bulk of winter clothing and equipment. The drainage itself created a wind tunnel effect that accelerated heat loss for both men, as the confined space channeled the wind and concentrated its cooling effect while eliminating any possibility of finding shelter from the elements. The rocky walls conducted heat away from their bodies through direct contact, while the confined space prevented them from moving around to generate body heat through physical activity. The temperature in the drainage was several degrees colder than the surrounding terrain due to cold air settling in the low-lying area. Ashford's injuries prevented him from generating body heat through movement or maintaining the insulation integrity of his clothing system, as the compound fracture and head trauma left him largely immobile, while his torn clothing allowed cold air to penetrate his insulation layers. Blood loss from his leg wound further compromised his body's ability to maintain core temperature, creating a medical emergency that would prove fatal even in ideal rescue conditions, with immediate helicopter evacuation. Steele recognized that their situation had become unsurvivable, but continued attempting rescue efforts, while his own hypothermia progressed through increasingly severe stages that affected his judgment and physical coordination. His medical training allowed him to understand the physiological processes occurring in both their bodies, making him acutely aware of how little time remained before hypothermia would render them both unconscious and unable to attempt further rescue efforts. If you're finding these survival breakdowns valuable, please subscribe and hit the bell. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more detailed breakdowns of these critical survival scenarios. His rescue attempts included trying to construct a rope and pulley system using their climbing gear, but the lack of secure anchor points and his deteriorating fine motor control made it impossible to complete the technical rigging required for such a system. The extreme cold was also affecting the flexibility and handling characteristics of their climbing rope, making it difficult to tie knots and manage the rope system effectively. His hands had lost significant dexterity despite his insulated gloves, making complex rope work nearly impossible. Ashford, semi-conscious from head trauma and blood loss, entered severe hypothermic shock as his core body temperature dropped below the threshold necessary to maintain vital organ function. His body's compensatory mechanisms, including shivering and peripheral vasoconstriction, had been overwhelmed by the combination of injuries, blood loss, and environmental heat loss that exceeded his physiological capacity to generate warmth. His breathing became shallow and irregular as his body began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core organ function. Steele's final rescue attempt involved constructing a debris shelter using available branches and snow, attempting to create a windbreak that might slow their heat loss and provide some protection from the elements. However, his coordination had deteriorated to the point where he could not complete the construction process effectively, as his hands could no longer manipulate materials with sufficient precision to build a structurally sound shelter. The materials available in the drainage were limited, consisting mainly of small branches and loose rock that provided inadequate insulation. Understanding that remaining with Ashford meant certain death for both men, he made the agonizing decision to climb out of the drainage and attempt to reach help, knowing that this represented their only remaining chance for survival. However, his physical condition had deteriorated beyond the point where such a climb was possible, and he collapsed from exhaustion and advanced hypothermia after climbing only 12 feet up the icy drainage walls. The collapse occurred when his leg muscles, weakened by hypothermia and exhaustion, could no longer support his body weight on the steep, icy surface. The rock was covered with a thin layer of ice that provided no secure footing, while his boots had lost traction capability as ice built up on the soles. He fell back into the drainage, sustaining additional injuries, including a dislocated shoulder that further compromised his ability to generate body heat and eliminated any remaining possibility of self-rescue. Both men lost consciousness as air temperatures dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset, with wind chill values reaching minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the exposed drainage. Their bodies' heat production had been overwhelmed by the combination of injuries, exhaustion, and extreme environmental conditions that exceeded the thermal protection capabilities of their equipment and clothing systems. The mathematical relationship between heat loss and heat production had become so unfavorable that survival was impossible regardless of their experience level or equipment quality. Throughout the night, as temperatures plummeted even further, both men's bodies entered the final stages of severe hypothermia. Steele, despite his medical training and understanding of what was happening, could do nothing to stop the inevitable progression. His core body temperature had dropped below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, causing his heart rhythm to become dangerously irregular. The extreme cold had overwhelmed every survival mechanism their bodies possessed. Ashford's condition deteriorated rapidly due to the combination of his traumatic injuries and the relentless cold. The blood loss from his compound fracture had reduced his body's ability to maintain circulation, while the head trauma affected his brain's ability to regulate basic functions. His breathing became increasingly shallow and erratic as his body prioritized blood flow to vital organs in a desperate attempt to maintain life. In the pre-dawn hours of January 9th, both men succumbed to the brutal mathematics of heat loss in extreme conditions. Their professional-grade equipment, extensive training, and years of experience had proven insufficient against the perfect storm of equipment failures, traumatic injury, and environmental conditions that exceeded human physiological limits. The drainage that had trapped them became their final resting place, a testament to how quickly even the most prepared mountaineers can find themselves overwhelmed by the unforgiving nature of high-altitude winter environments. When neither man returned by 11 p.m., their families contacted local search and rescue authorities, initiating emergency response protocols for overdue mountaineers. However, ground rescue teams could not deploy until morning due to extreme weather conditions and zero visibility that made helicopter operations impossible and ground travel extremely dangerous for rescue personnel. Rescue teams following their tracks through the snow found Steele's body in the drainage at 1:45 p.m. the next day, with Ashford's body located 20 feet away at 2:10 p.m. Both men were found in positions indicating they had remained conscious long enough to understand their situation and make final preparations. The scene investigation revealed the sequence of events that had led to their deaths, including the collapsed snow bridge that had caused Ashford's fall, and the evidence of Steele's multiple rescue attempts. The coroner's report determined that both men died from severe hypothermia, with Ashford suffering additional fatal head trauma and blood loss from his fall into the drainage. The tragedy prompted local search and rescue organizations to emphasize equipment redundancy and regular testing of emergency beacons in their winter safety courses, serving as a reminder that technical expertise cannot eliminate the risks inherent in extreme mountain environments when multiple critical systems fail simultaneously. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.